The acrid smell of gunpowder still clung to General Ulysses Simpson, Grant's uniform, as he dismounted his horse near the crossroads of Cold Harbor, Virginia, on the morning of June 1st, 1864. Behind him stretched the weary columns of the Army of the Potomac, their faces etched with the grim determination of men who had seen too much death in the past month. The Overland Campaign had been a relentless grinding machine of human lives, and Cold Harbor would prove to be its most terrible cog. Lieutenant Colonel Horace Porter, Grant's aide-de-camp, approached with dispatches clutched in his mud-stained hands. The young officer's eyes held the haunted look that had become commonplace among the Union staff since crossing the Rapidan River in early May. "General, we've received word from General Philip Henry Sheridan's cavalry," Porter reported, his voice barely audible above the rumble of artillery wagons. "They've secured the crossroads, but Confederate forces are massing just beyond the tree line." Grant studied the terrain through his field glasses, noting the gentle rises in thick woodland that characterized this corner of Hanover County. Cold Harbor was nothing more than a rural crossroads, its name derived from a tavern that offered shelter but no hot meals to travelers. Yet this unremarkable intersection of country roads would soon become synonymous with one of the most devastating tactical blunders in American military history. The strategic importance of Cold Harbor lay not in its geography, but in its position. Control of these crossroads would determine whether Grant could continue his advance toward Richmond or whether Confederate General Robert Edward Lee could force another costly stalemate. For 6 weeks, the two armies had been locked in a deadly dance across Virginia, from the Wilderness to Spotsylvania Courthouse, each engagement claiming thousands of lives with little to show for the sacrifice. As reported in Harper's Weekly. During the summer of 1864, the Union Army had already suffered over 50,000 casualties since beginning the Overland Campaign, a staggering toll that had shocked the Northern public and tested President Abraham Lincoln's resolve. Major General Winfield Scott Hancock's Second Corps had arrived during the night, their approach masked by the darkness and the ever-present sound of digging. The Confederates, under Lee's masterful direction, had spent the hours since Sheridan's initial occupation transforming the countryside into a fortress. Every tree, every depression, every slight rise in the ground was being incorporated into an intricate defensive network that would make Cold Harbor a killing field. General Lee himself had arrived at the Confederate positions before dawn, his gray horse Traveler picking its way carefully through the maze of earthworks and abatis that his men had constructed with desperate efficiency. At 57, Lee carried the weight of a dying cause on his shoulders, but his tactical brilliance remained undiminished. He understood better than any of his subordinates that the Army of Northern Virginia could not sustain many more engagements like the Wilderness or Spotsylvania. Each battle, even when tactically successful, bled his forces white. The morning mist began to lift, revealing the magnitude of the forces gathering at Cold Harbor. Nearly 100,000 Union soldiers faced approximately 60,000 Confederates, but numbers alone would not determine the outcome of what was to come. The next 72 hours would witness decisions that would haunt Grant for the remainder of his life and reshape American military doctrine for generations to come. General Robert Edward Lee stood motionless behind the Confederate earthworks. As the first rays of sunlight pierced the Virginia morning on June 2nd, 1864, his weathered hands, which had once drawn precise engineering diagrams at West Point, now traced the defensive lines that his Army of Northern Virginia had carved from the red clay soil of Cold Harbor. Every trench, every traverse, every carefully positioned artillery piece represented Lee's evolution from the aggressive commander who had launched audacious attacks at Gettysburg to the defensive mastermind who now understood that survival depended on making every Union advance prohibitively costly. Lieutenant General James Longstreet's First Corps occupied the Confederate right, their positions anchored on the Chickahominy River. Despite being wounded at the Wilderness, Longstreet had insisted on returning to command, his presence bolstering the morale of troops who had followed him through countless battles. His men worked through the night, using bayonets, tin cups, and bare hands to deepen their trenches and strengthen the interconnected network of fortifications that would soon earn the nickname Lee's Gibraltar. The Confederate center belonged to Lieutenant General Ambrose Powell Hill's 3rd Corps, though Hill himself was suffering from one of his recurring bouts of illness that would plague him throughout the war. His division commanders, men like Major General Henry Hett and Major General Cadmus Marcellus Wilcox, supervised the construction of what military historians would later recognize as some of the most sophisticated field fortifications of the Civil War era. These were not the simple rifle pits of earlier engagements, but complex defensive systems featuring overlapping fields of fire, protected artillery positions, and carefully constructed obstacles designed to channel attacking forces into predetermined killing zones. Lieutenant General Richard Stoddard Ewell commanded the Confederate left, his 2nd Corps positioned to guard against any Union attempt to turn Lee's flank. Ewell, who had lost a leg at 2nd Manassas and now relied on crutches to move about his lines, compensated for his physical limitations with an intimate knowledge of defensive tactics learned through bitter experience. His men had become experts at reading the ground, understanding instinctively how every fold in the terrain could be transformed into an advantage. As the morning progressed, Confederate Artillery Chief, Brigadier General William Nelson Pendleton, coordinated the placement of guns that would provide devastating enfilade fire against any Union assault. The Confederate artillery, though outnumbered by their Union counterparts, held the crucial advantage of prepared positions and clear fields of fire. Every battery had been sighted not just to deliver direct fire to their front, but to provide crossfire support to adjacent positions. Major General Jubal Anderson Early, commanding a division under Ewell, moved among his troops with the casual confidence of a man who had seen the elephant many times before. Early understood that the next few hours would test not just the physical courage of his soldiers, but their ability to maintain discipline under what promised to be the most intense artillery bombardment many had ever experienced. He had positioned his sharpshooters in advanced positions, hidden among the trees and brush that dotted the approaches to the Confederate lines. The genius of Lee's defensive arrangement lay not in any single innovation, but in the way he had integrated every element into a coherent whole. Infantry positions were mutually supporting. Artillery was positioned to deliver both direct and indirect fire, and the natural obstacles of the terrain had been enhanced with man-made obstacles that would force attacking troops to bunch together as they approached the Confederate lines. Most importantly, Lee had created multiple fallback positions, ensuring that even if the Union forces breached the first line of defense, they would immediately face fresh obstacles and concentrated fire from prepared positions. Communication between different parts of the Confederate line relied on a network of covered trenches and signal stations that allowed Lee to rapidly shift reinforcements to threatened sectors. This flexibility would prove crucial in the coming battle, as Grant's forces would launch multiple uncoordinated attacks that Lee could defeat in detail by concentrating his available reserves at the point of greatest danger. By mid-morning on June 2nd, the Confederate position at Cold Harbor represented the culmination of 3 years of hard-won experience in defensive warfare. Every lesson learned from Antietam to Gettysburg had been incorporated into these earthworks, creating what would prove to be a nearly impregnable fortress that would exact a terrible price from any force attempting to storm it. General Ulysses Simpson Grant paced the length of his field headquarters, a modest tent pitched beneath a grove of oak trees, barely a mile from the Confederate earthworks. The weight of command had never felt heavier as he contemplated the intelligence reports scattered across his makeshift desk. Maps marked with red and blue lines told the story of 6 weeks of relentless fighting that had cost the Union Army more casualties than many entire campaigns of earlier wars. Yet Richmond remained tantalizingly close, protected by Lee's Army of Northern Virginia, and the growing network of fortifications that seemed to spring from the Virginia soil like some malevolent crop. Major General George Gordon Meade, commander of the Army of the Potomac, entered the tent with the measured gait of a man carrying unwelcome news. Since Grant had been elevated to General-in-Chief, Meade's role had become increasingly uncomfortable, retaining nominal command of the army while Grant made the crucial tactical decisions. The arrangement had worked during the early stages of the Overland Campaign, but the mounting casualties and lack of decisive victory had strained the relationship between the two generals. Ulysses, the reconnaissance reports from all corps' commanders are consistent. Meade began, using Grant's first name in the informal style that characterized their working relationship. Lee has constructed the most formidable defensive position we've encountered since Petersburg, actually, more formidable than Petersburg. Every approach is covered by interlocking fields of fire, and our cavalry reports indicate that the Confederate line extends for nearly 7 miles. Grant studied the reports from his corps' commanders with the methodical attention to detail that had served him well at Vicksburg and Chattanooga. Major General Winfield Scott Hancock's Second Corps held the Union left, positioned opposite Lee's right flank near the Chickahominy River. Hancock, the hero of Gettysburg, had expressed private reservations about launching a frontal assault against prepared positions. Memories of Pickett's charge undoubtedly fresh in his mind. The Union center belonged to Major General Horatio Gouverneur Wright's Sixth Corps, recently transferred from the Washington defenses to replace the heavy casualties suffered by other units during the campaign. Wright's men were relatively fresh compared to the battle-hardened veterans of other corps, but they lacked the combat experience that would be crucial in the coming engagement. Major General William Farrar Smith's 18th Corps, borrowed from Major General Benjamin Franklin Butler's Army of the James, occupied the right of the Union line. Smith, known to his subordinates as Baldy Smith, despite retaining a full head of hair, commanded troops who had seen limited action compared to the Army of the Potomac veterans. The integration of Smith's corps into Grant's battle plan represented both an opportunity and a risk, as these units were unfamiliar with the tactical methods that had evolved during the Overland Campaign. As described in the contemporary account published in the Atlantic Monthly later that year, Grant faced a strategic dilemma that would define his entire approach to the final year of the Civil War. Political pressure from Washington demanded results before the upcoming presidential election, while military reality suggested that Lee's position at Cold Harbor was virtually impregnable to direct assault. Grant's staff officers moved quietly around the headquarters tent, each carrying pieces of the complex puzzle that would determine the fate of thousands of men in the coming hours. Colonel Ely Samuel Parker, Grant's military secretary and one of the few Native Americans to hold senior rank in the U.S. Army, prepared the orders that would set the Union forces in motion. Parker's presence at Grant's side represented the diversity of the Union cause, even as the Army of the Potomac prepared to launch what many officers privately feared would be a hopeless assault. The pressure of time weighed heavily on Grant's decision-making process. Every day spent in front of Confederate fortifications allowed Lee to strengthen his positions and potentially receive reinforcements from other theaters. Yet the cost of a failed assault could be measured not just in casualties, but in the potential collapse of Northern morale at a crucial moment in the war's progress. Lieutenant Colonel Horace Porter observed his commander's internal struggle, noting in his later memoirs how Grant's usual calm demeanor showed signs of the strain that came with making decisions that would determine the lives of tens of thousands of soldiers. The young aide understood that whatever orders emerged from the headquarters tent in the next few hours would either crown Grant's military career with decisive victory or burden him with responsibility for one of the war's greatest disasters. As afternoon shadows began to lengthen on June 2nd, Grant faced the moment of decision that would define not only the Battle of Cold Harbor, but his entire legacy as a military commander. The sun had barely crested the horizon on June 3, 1864, when the first Union artillery pieces opened fire across the fields of Cold Harbor. General Grant's headquarters tent buzzed with activity as staff officers carried final orders to corps commanders positioned along a front that stretched for nearly 6 miles through the Virginia countryside. The decision had been made during the pre-dawn hours, despite mounting evidence that Lee's defensive positions had grown stronger with each passing hour. Major General Winfield Scott Hancock received his orders at 4:30 in the morning. The familiar handwriting of Grant's staff barely visible in the flickering light of a camp lantern. The Second Corps would advance against the Confederate right, attacking positions that intelligence reports described as heavily fortified with multiple lines of earthworks and extensive abattis. Hancock, whose corps had suffered enormous casualties during the Overland Campaign, understood the implications better than most of his fellow commanders. The orders called for a simultaneous assault by 3 corps at precisely 4:30 in the morning, time to take advantage of the half-light that might conceal the advancing formations until they reached close range of the Confederate lines. Major General Horatio Wright's 6th Corps would strike the Confederate center, while Major General William Smith's 18th Corps attacked the left flank. The plan assumed that coordinated pressure along multiple points would prevent Lee from concentrating his reserves at any single threatened sector. What the orders could not account for was the reality of Civil War communications and the complexity of coordinating large-scale attacks across difficult terrain. Unlike modern armies with radio communications, Civil War commanders relied on messengers, signal flags, and drums to coordinate their movements. The margin for error was enormous, and the consequences of miscommunication could be catastrophic. Colonel Nelson Appleton Miles, commanding a brigade in Hancock's corps, studied the ground his men would have to cross with the practiced eye of a veteran infantry officer. The approach to the Confederate lines led across open fields dotted with stumps and fallen trees, natural obstacles that would disrupt formation integrity and provide cover for Confederate sharpshooters. Beyond these fields lay the earthworks that Lee's army had been strengthening for the past 48 hours. The Confederate preparations had transformed the landscape into a defensive masterpiece that would have impressed European military engineers. Major General John Brown Gordon's division, positioned in the path of Hancock's advance, had created a killing field that incorporated every lesson learned from 3 years of warfare. Trenches had been dug in zigzag patterns to minimize the effect of enfilade fire, while artillery positions had been carefully sited to provide overlapping coverage of all likely avenues of approach. Behind the Confederate lines, General Lee moved among his troops with the quiet confidence that had sustained the Army of Northern Virginia through countless engagements. Despite being outnumbered nearly 2-to-1, Lee understood that defensive positions could multiply the effectiveness of his available forces. Every Confederate soldier would be fighting from prepared positions, while the Union attackers would have to advance across open ground under concentrated fire. As documented in the Century magazine's comprehensive series on Civil War battles, published in the 1880s, the morning of June 3rd witnessed one of the most one-sided engagements of the entire conflict. The coordination that Grant's plan required proved impossible to achieve under battlefield conditions, with different corps launching their attacks at different times and against different objectives. The first indication that the assault was failing came within minutes of the initial advance. Union soldiers who had survived the carnage at Spotsylvania Courthouse in the Wilderness found themselves facing defensive positions that were stronger and more sophisticated than anything they had previously encountered. The Confederate earthworks channeled attacking forces into predetermined killing zones, while artillery positioned on the flanks delivered devastating enfilade fire that swept entire regiments from the field. Brigadier General Francis Channing, Barlow's division in Hancock's corps, managed to reach the Confederate outer works, only to discover that Lee had constructed multiple defensive lines. Even if the first line could be carried, attacking forces would immediately face fresh obstacles and concentrated fire from positions that had been prepared specifically to deal with breakthrough attempts. The sound of battle reached Grant's headquarters as a continuous roar of musketry, punctuated by the deeper boom of artillery. Staff officers attempted to gather information from the various corps commanders, but the breakdown in communications that had plagued the initial attack continued to hamper efforts to assess the situation. What was becoming clear, however, was that the assault was not proceeding according to plan. Within 2 hours of the initial attack, the fields in front of the Confederate positions were littered with Union casualties, and it had become apparent that Grant's gamble had failed catastrophically. The orders that had seemed reasonable in the pre-dawn darkness now appeared to have sent thousands of men to their deaths in a hopeless assault against impregnable positions. The morning of June 3rd, 1864, transformed the pastoral countryside of Cold Harbor into a scene that would haunt the memories of survivors for the remainder of their lives. By 6 o'clock, barely 90 minutes after the initial Union assault began, the fields between the opposing lines resembled a charnel house where the blue uniforms of fallen soldiers created a grotesque carpet across the Virginia landscape. The coordinated attack that Grant had envisioned had devolved into a series of piecemeal assaults that Confederate defenders repulsed with methodical efficiency. Major General Winfield Scott Hancock's Second Corps bore the heaviest casualties. During the opening phase of the battle, the Irish Brigade, already decimated by previous engagements, advanced with their characteristic green flags flying despite knowing that they were marching toward almost certain death. Colonel Patrick Kelly, commanding the brigade, fell within sight of the Confederate earthworks, his body joining those of hundreds of other Union soldiers who would never see their homes again. The tragedy of Cold Harbor lay not in the courage of individual soldiers, but in the tactical obsolescence of the orders they were attempting to execute. Civil War infantry tactics had evolved little since the Napoleonic era, yet defensive capabilities had been revolutionized by rifled muskets, improved artillery, and sophisticated field fortifications. The result was a killing field where courage became synonymous with futility. Brigadier General Francis Channing, Barlow's division managed to penetrate the Confederate outer works on the Union left, achieving what would prove to be the deepest advance of the entire battle. Barlow himself, leading from the front in the tradition of Civil War general officers, was wounded early in the assault but continued to direct his men until loss of blood forced him to relinquish command. His temporary success served only to highlight the hopelessness of the overall effort, as Confederate reserves quickly sealed the breach and subjected the exposed Union troops to devastating crossfire. Behind the Confederate earthworks, the efficiency of Lee's defensive arrangements became apparent as the battle progressed. Major General John Brown Gordon's division, occupying positions directly in front of Hancock's advance, delivered disciplined volleys that cut down attacking formations before they could close to effective range. Confederate artillery, positioned to provide enfilade fire along the Union line of advance, proved devastatingly effective against formations that were forced to bunch together as they navigated the obstacles in their path. The horror of the assault was compounded by the breakdown in Union command and control. Major General Horatio Wright's Sixth Corps, intended to attack simultaneously with Hancock's forces, launched their advance nearly an hour late due to confusion over orders and difficult terrain. This delay allowed Confederate commanders to shift reserves from threatened sectors to reinforce positions under attack, effectively defeating the Union forces in detail. As reported in Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper later that summer. Eyewitness Accounts described scenes of unimaginable carnage as Union formations melted away under the concentrated fire of Lee's defenders. Soldiers who had survived Gettysburg and the Wilderness spoke of Cold Harbor as the most horrific engagement they had ever experienced, a battle where tactical considerations had been subordinated to a strategic gamble that failed catastrophically. Major General William Farrar Smith's 18th Corps, attacking the Confederate left, encountered defensive positions that had been strengthened by 2 full days of preparation. Lieutenant General Richard Ewell's 2nd Corps, commanded by men who had learned the art of defensive warfare through bitter experience, demonstrated how prepared positions could multiply the effectiveness of available forces. Every attacking formation found itself channeled into predetermined killing zones where Confederate marksmen could deliver accurate fire at point-blank range. The sound of battle reached Union hospitals located miles behind the lines, a continuous roar of musketry that spoke of casualties beyond the capacity of medical services to handle. Surgeons who had dealt with the aftermath of Spotsylvania and the Wilderness found themselves overwhelmed by the sheer volume of wounded men streaming back from the Cold Harbor assault. Many wounded soldiers would lie between the lines for days, as Confederate and Union forces were unable to arrange truces that would allow medical personnel to retrieve casualties. By 8 o'clock in the morning, barely 3.5 hours after the assault began, it had become clear that Grant's attack had failed completely. Union formations that had advanced with confidence in the pre-dawn darkness were now scattered remnants, seeking whatever cover they could find in the open ground between the lines. The tactical situation had become static, with both sides occupying positions that would change little over the next several days. The human cost of the morning's fighting was staggering even by Civil War standards. Conservative estimates placed Union casualties at over 7,000 men killed, wounded, or missing, while Confederate losses numbered fewer than 1,500. The disparity reflected not any lack of courage on the part of Union soldiers, but the fundamental tactical reality that defensive positions held by determined troops could not be carried by frontal assault regardless of the numerical superiority of the attacking force. The immediate aftermath of the failed assault at Cold Harbor presented General Grant with a crisis that extended far beyond the tactical situation on the Virginia battlefield. By noon on June 3, 1864, the full magnitude of the disaster had become apparent to Union commanders at every level. Staff officers moved through Grant's headquarters with the subdued efficiency of men processing a catastrophe, while reports from Corps commanders painted a picture of devastation that exceeded even the bloodiest engagements of the Overland Campaign. Dr. Jonathan Letterman, the Union Army's medical director, established field hospitals in every available building within miles of the battlefield. Churches, schools, and private homes were converted into makeshift surgical facilities where overwhelmed medical personnel worked around the clock to treat casualties that far exceeded their capacity to provide adequate care. The scenes in these hospitals would haunt the memories of nurses and surgeons for decades after the war's conclusion. Major General Winfield Scott Hancock, his 2nd Corps having suffered the heaviest casualties during the morning assault, submitted a report that captured the futility of the Union effort in stark military terminology. The enemy's position was found to be exceedingly strong, consisting of a double line of breastworks with ditches, and so constructed as to give a crossfire upon our advancing columns, Hancock wrote. The approaches were over open ground, affording no cover whatever for the attacking party. The tactical lessons of Cold Harbor were immediately apparent to professional soldiers on both sides, though the strategic implications would take years to fully understand. The battle demonstrated conclusively that Civil War defensive positions, when properly prepared and adequately manned, could not be carried by frontal assault regardless of the courage or numerical superiority of the attacking force. This reality would shape military thinking for the remainder of the conflict and influence American military doctrine well into the 20th century. General Lee, surveying the Confederate positions in the hours following the Union withdrawal, understood that Cold Harbor represented both a tactical triumph and a strategic warning. While his Army of Northern Virginia had inflicted devastating casualties on Grant's forces, the Confederate position remained fundamentally defensive. Lee lacked the strength to launch the kind of offensive operations that might force Grant to abandon his advance toward Richmond, leaving the Confederacy in the position of trading space for time while hoping for political developments that might end the war. As documented in Harper's Weekly during the summer of 1864, Northern newspapers struggled to explain the disaster at Cold Harbor to a public that had been led to expect decisive results from Grant's promotion to General-in-Chief. Editorial writers who had praised Grant's victories at Vicksburg and Chattanooga now questioned whether the general who had succeeded in the Western theater could adapt his methods to the different challenges of campaigning against Lee in Virginia. Political ramifications of Cold Harbor extended directly into the Lincoln administration's planning for the upcoming presidential election. Secretary of War Edwin McMaster Stanton found himself defending Grant's conduct of the campaign before congressional committees that were increasingly skeptical of the administration's military leadership. The mounting casualty lists from the Overland Campaign had already strained Northern morale, and Cold Harbor threatened to undermine public support for continuing the war at the very moment when Confederate resistance was beginning to weaken in other theaters. Grant himself struggled with the personal burden of responsibility for the Cold Harbor disaster. Unlike his previous campaigns, where tactical setbacks could be offset by strategic gains, the assault of June 3rd had achieved nothing while costing thousands of lives. In his later memoirs, Grant would write that he regretted the order for the final assault at Cold Harbor more than any other decision of his military career, a remarkable admission from a general who had made life-and-death decisions throughout 4 years of warfare. The soldiers who survived the Cold Harbor assault carried physical and psychological scars that would affect them for the remainder of their lives. Veterans of the battle spoke of June 3, 1864, in terms that foreshadowed the language used by survivors of later conflicts to describe the trauma of industrial warfare. The systematic nature of the killing at Cold Harbor, where defensive positions allowed Confederate troops to deliver aimed fire at helpless targets, created a psychological impact that differed qualitatively from the more chaotic violence of earlier battles. Confederate soldiers, despite their tactical success, were also affected by the one-sided nature of the Cold Harbor fighting. Many Southern veterans later wrote of their discomfort at shooting down Union soldiers who were advancing with obvious courage toward positions that could not be carried. The professional respect that had developed between opposing armies during 3 years of fighting was strained by engagements where tactical realities created situations that resembled execution more than combat. The strategic situation following Cold Harbor forced both armies to confront the reality that the war had entered a new phase. Neither side possessed the strength to achieve decisive victory through single engagements, yet the political and economic pressures driving the conflict made negotiated settlement increasingly unlikely. Part 7. Legacy of a costly lesson. The silence that settled over the Cold Harbor battlefield on the evening of June 3, 1864, marked more than the end of a single day's fighting. It signaled the conclusion of an era in American military history when battles could be decided by courage and elan rather than by the cold mathematics of firepower and field fortifications. The lessons learned in the red clay of Virginia would reshape American military doctrine and influence strategic thinking for generations of officers who would fight in conflicts that Grant and Lee could never have imagined. In the days following the assault, both armies settled into the kind of static confrontation that would characterize the final year of the Civil War. Union and Confederate soldiers dug elaborate trench systems that stretched for miles across the Virginia countryside. creating a preview of the Western Front that would dominate European warfare 50 years later. The tactical innovations developed at Cold Harbor, interlocking fields of fire, multiple defensive lines, and sophisticated obstacles, would be studied by military professionals around the world as examples of how defensive positions could neutralize numerical superiority. President Abraham Lincoln, receiving reports of the Cold Harbor casualties in the White House, understood immediately that the battle had created political complications that extended far beyond military considerations. The upcoming presidential election of 1864 would be fought against the backdrop of mounting casualty lists that tested Northern resolve at the very moment when Confederate resistance was beginning to weaken in other theaters. Lincoln's political survival, and with it the continuation of the war effort, would depend on his ability to maintain public support despite tactical disasters like Cold Harbor. General Grant's response to the Cold Harbor defeat demonstrated the psychological resilience that had carried him through earlier campaigns. Rather than allowing the tactical failure to paralyze his strategic thinking, Grant began planning the movements that would ultimately lead to the siege of Petersburg and the final campaigns of the war. The lesson of Cold Harbor was not that offensive operations were impossible, but that they required careful preparation and realistic assessment of defensive capabilities. The medical innovations developed in response to Cold Harbor casualties would have lasting impact on American healthcare. The overwhelming number of wounded soldiers forced Union medical personnel to develop triage systems and surgical techniques that would influence civilian medical practice for decades after the war's conclusion. The psychological wounds inflicted by the battle also contributed to growing awareness of what would later be recognized as combat stress disorders, though effective treatment would not be developed until the 20th century. As reported in The Nation magazine during the post-war period, Cold Harbor became a symbol of the industrial warfare that characterized the final phases of the Civil War. The battle demonstrated how technological advances in weaponry had outpaced tactical doctrine, creating situations where traditional military virtues became liabilities rather than assets. This lesson would influence American military education and planning through the Spanish-American War and into the world wars of the 20th century. Confederate General Robert E. Lee's tactical triumph at Cold Harbor paradoxically hastened the ultimate defeat of the Confederacy by demonstrating that defensive victories could not compensate for the fundamental strategic weaknesses that plagued the Southern war effort. While Lee's army had inflicted devastating casualties on Grant's forces, the Confederate position remained essentially passive, allowing Union forces to maintain the initiative and choose the time and place of future engagements. The soldiers who fought at Cold Harbor carried the memory of June 3, 1864, with them for the remainder of their lives. Union veterans struggled with the knowledge that their sacrifice had achieved nothing, while Confederate survivors were haunted by the systematic nature of the killing they had witnessed. The battle created a shared trauma that transcended sectional boundaries and contributed to the eventual reconciliation between North and South. Modern military historians recognize Cold Harbor as a pivotal moment in the evolution of warfare, a battle that demonstrated how defensive positions could neutralize attacking forces, regardless of their numerical superiority or individual courage. The tactical lessons learned at Cold Harbor influenced American military doctrine through 2 world wars and continue to shape contemporary thinking about the relationship between offense and defense in military operations. The true legacy of Cold Harbor lies not in its immediate tactical results, but in its demonstration that warfare had entered a new era where traditional concepts of military honor and individual heroism would be subordinated to the industrial logic of firepower and entrenchment. The battle marked the end of Napoleonic warfare in America and the beginning of the modern military age, where victory would depend more on logistics, technology, and strategic patience than on the clan and courage that had characterized earlier conflicts. The cost in human lives. Over 7,000 Union casualties in a single morning served as a stark reminder that military progress often comes at an unacceptable price, a lesson that would resonate through American military history. From the trenches of World War I to the jungles of Vietnam and beyond,